I have been buried alive for 9 years, 2 months, and 14 days. The Empire simply hasn't bothered to dig up my corpse yet. The iron door of my cell groaned shut with a sound like grinding bones, and I understood in that moment that I would never again feel the warm sun on my face or breathe air that didn't taste of mildew and despair. The guards didn't need to read my sentence aloud because in the Imperial Prison system, your crime stops mattering the moment you cross the threshold. Theft, murder, conspiracy against the Elder Council, unpaid taxes, speaking too loudly in the presence of a Thalmor justiciar who decided your accent sounded like treason. It all becomes the same gray mass of guilt that justifies whatever comes next. Here in the bowels of the Imperial Prison, there is no rehabilitation, no redemption, no carefully measured punishment that fits the crime. There is only endurance, and the slow certainty that the person who entered this place will not be the thing that leaves it. If anything leaves at all, the intake chamber of the Imperial Prison in the Imperial City smells like a tomb that's still being filled. Rotten torch smoke and the acrid stench of fear sweat mixing into something that coats your throat and makes you want to vomit. Except vomiting would draw attention, and attention in this place is always, always dangerous. We stood in lines that stretched back into darkness, our shackles clicking against stone floors worn smooth by 10,000 pairs of shuffling feet before ours. The woman beside me, a Breton merchant who'd been caught smuggling moon sugar through coral, wept silently as the prison mages examined us one by one. Her tears fell onto the ancient flagstones and vanished instantly, absorbed by rock that had drunk the moisture and misery of generations. The mage who catalogued my existence was an Imperial with dead eyes and hands that glowed with detection spells as he pressed them against my chest. He was searching for diseases, for curses, for magical augmentations that might make me dangerous or valuable. His face showed no curiosity, no interest, no recognition that I was anything more than another object to be processed and filed away in the correct category. He worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had examined so many prisoners that we'd stopped being people and become simply inventory. "Prisoner Ford 117, he said, his voice flat and administrative. "Classification, political, subclassification, sedition, minor, cell assignment, deep level 3, expected survival duration 6 to 14 months. 6 to 14 months. They'd calculated my death before I'd even seen my cell, run some internal formula that weighed my age and health against the conditions I'd face and produced a number that would determine how soon they'd need to process my replacement. The precision of it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. They didn't hate us enough to want us dead immediately, but they didn't value us enough to keep us alive any longer than was economically efficient. The prison uniform they gave me was the color of dried blood, rough-spun wool that chafed against my skin and smelled of whoever had worn it before me. I tried not to think about whether they'd died in it or simply grown too sick to need clothing anymore. The fabric was designed not for comfort, but for easy identification. The crimson marking us as property of the Empire, as things that had been removed from society and could be disposed of without consequence. My cell was a cube carved from the living rock beneath the Imperial City, 3 meters wide by 2 meters deep, with a ceiling just low enough that I had to hunch my shoulders to stand fully upright. The walls wept with condensation constantly, creating patterns of moisture that looked like maps of provinces I'd never see again. A narrow slot near the floor allowed guards to slide in my daily meal, and a barred window at eye level let them observe me whenever they chose. There was no glass, no source of natural light. Just torches in the corridor outside that created a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to track the passage of days. The sleeping platform was a stone shelf built into the wall, no mattress, no blanket, no pillow except the uniform on my back. The cold seeped up through the rock within minutes, settling into my bones like an infection that fed on warmth and will. I learned quickly that sleep in this place wasn't rest, but merely another form of endurance. A temporary escape from consciousness that left me feeling more exhausted than when I'd closed my eyes. The first night I listened to the Imperial Prison breathe around me. The stone carried sounds from distant cells, fragments of prayers to the 9 divines, curses in languages I didn't recognize. The wet coughing of someone dying of rock joint or brain rot or simple despair. Somewhere below me, someone was screaming, a raw animal sound that went on until it became part of the ambient noise, no more remarkable than the dripping water or the scurrying of rats in the walls. I counted the seconds between guard patrols, memorizing their rhythm like a mantra. Every 9 minutes and 17 seconds, heavy boots would echo down the corridor, pause for exactly 6 seconds while they checked my window, then continue to the next cell. The guards were Imperials mostly, some Nords, their faces hard and their eyes empty of anything resembling compassion. They'd learned to see us not as people but as problems to be managed, as items on an inventory list that occasionally required maintenance or disposal. The morning brought my first meal, though calling it by such a generous name felt like mockery. A wooden bowl slid through the food slot containing gray porridge that tasted of nothing and everything simultaneously. Spoiled grain mixed with what might have been rat meat, or might have been something worse, seasoned with ash and desperation. I ate it with my fingers because no utensils were provided, licking the bowl clean because I didn't know when the next meal would come or if it would come at all. Later, much later, I learned that the food contained more than simple nutrition, mild alchemical compounds to reduce aggression, ingredients to prevent certain diseases while leaving us vulnerable to others. Trace amounts of substances that made the mind more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of planning complex actions. The first few weeks of ingesting this chemical slurry left me feeling disconnected from my own thoughts, as if I were watching someone else live my life through a sheet of dirty glass. The other prisoners were shadows at first, glimpsed through gaps in cell doors or heard as disembodied voices in the darkness. The man in the cell to my left had been there for 8 years. He'd been a tax collector in Breville, convicted of embezzling from the Legion payroll to feed his family during a famine. His name was Caius, and he talked constantly to keep madness at bay, whispering through the thin gap where our cells met. "The trick is remembering who you were," he told me on my third night, his voice hoarse from years of bad air. "Hold on to something, anything from before. A smell, a song, the way your wife's hair looked in candlelight. The moment you let go of that, you become what they want you to become. You become inventory." The woman across the corridor cried in her sleep every night for the first month I was there. Her dreams were full of fire and the screaming of children. She'd been a healer in Kvatch, charged with negligent homicide because she'd run out of restore health potions during a bandit raid and 3 of her patients had died. Her crime was poverty, and her punishment was to relive the consequences of that poverty until she died herself. Work began on my 7th day. They woke us before dawn, which meant nothing in a place where dawn was a concept from another life, and marched us through corridors that twisted deeper into the earth than seemed possible. The Imperial Prison wasn't merely a place of confinement, but an entire industrial complex built around the efficient extraction of labor from disposable human resources. My assignment was the foundries, a massive cavern where we smelted iron ore and refined ebony for the Legion's forges. The heat was carefully maintained at just below the threshold of what human flesh could endure, hot enough to weaken us to make every breath feel like inhaling fire, but not quite hot enough to kill us quickly. The air was thick with smoke and metal particles that settled in the lungs and left a taste like blood on the tongue. We worked in teams of 10, our movements choreographed by the rhythm of the furnaces and the ever-present threat of the shock spells carried by our supervisors. The work was simple but brutal, hauling ore from carts to furnaces, working the bellows until your arms felt like they'd tear from their sockets, pouring molten metal into molds while the heat blistered any exposed skin. Each task had to meet precise specifications, and failure to maintain quality or pace resulted in immediate punishment. The punishments were creative in their efficiency. A worker whose hands shook too much from exhaustion might have those hands locked in iron rings that forced them to work in increasingly painful positions. Someone who fell behind the pace would be hit with a shock spell that kept them conscious and functional, even as their body began to shut down from fatigue. The supervisors, prison mages who'd accepted their positions in exchange for reduced sentences or because they genuinely enjoyed the work, took careful notes on which punishments improved productivity most effectively. I learned to lose myself in the work, to let my mind drift away from my body while my hands continued their mechanical movements. This dissociation was survival, a way of preserving some small core of self while the prison consumed everything else. But it came at a cost. Days blurred together into an endless present where past and future became abstract concepts. I began to forget things. The name of my hometown, the face of my brother, the reason I'd been arrested in the first place. The details of my life before prison started feeling like stories someone had told me about a stranger. The social structure of the Imperial Prison was as complex as it was vicious. Power flowed not from official authority, but from strength, cunning, and the willingness to do violence without hesitation. The strongest prisoners, usually former Legion soldiers or members of the Fighters Guild, established themselves as leaders of informal gangs that controlled the distribution of contraband, the assignment of sleeping spots, and access to the few privileges that existed in this place. They demanded tribute in the form of food rations, protection services, or information about guard movements and prison operations. Their enforcement methods were brutal and immediate. A prisoner who refused to pay or who challenged their authority might find themselves beaten bloody in a dark corner, or worse, might simply disappear entirely. Their absence explained away as a failed escape attempt or a successful one, depending on what story best served the leadership's interests. I aligned myself with a group led by a Nord named Bjorn Ironhand, a former Legion centurion who'd been convicted of desertion during the Oblivion Crisis. He claimed he'd been saving civilians when his commanding officer branded him a coward. And whether that was true or not, he understood the value of discipline and organization better than most. Under his protection, I learned the unwritten rules that governed life in the Imperial Prison: never show weakness, because weakness was blood in the water and the predators here were always hungry. Never volunteer for anything, because volunteers were the first selected for the most dangerous work details or experimental rehabilitation programs. Never trust anyone completely, because betrayal was sometimes the only currency that could buy survival. And never ever give up hope, because hope was the only thing separating the living from the walking dead, even if that hope was nothing more than the possibility of dying quickly instead of slowly. The guards encouraged conflict between prisoners because fighting inmates were easier to control than organized ones. They deliberately create situations where we competed for resources or privileges, then step back and watch us tear each other apart with the detached interest of scholars observing Kwama in a colony. The winners of these conflicts received small rewards, extra food, improved cell assignments, lighter work duty. But the victories were always temporary and the costs were always permanent. I killed my first man on a Thursday, or what I'd decided to call Thursday in the timeless hell of our underground world. His name was Varro, a Dunmer who'd been a tax collector before his arrest for skimming from Imperial revenues. He was quick and clever, with the cunning of someone who'd spent his life finding ways to take what belonged to others. He'd been stealing from my food rations for weeks, taking just enough that I felt constantly hungry, but not so much that I noticed the theft immediately. When I finally caught him, his hand in my bowl while I was at the latrines, he laughed. He told me I was too weak to do anything about it, that I was just another soft Imperial who'd die within the year. He was wrong about that last part. The beating I gave him was not passionate or angry, but methodical, calculated to inflict maximum damage while avoiding the attention of guards. I used techniques I'd learned watching other inmates settle their disputes, targeting joints and soft tissue where the evidence of violence would be less visible, using my weight and leverage rather than wild swings that would exhaust me. When he stopped moving, I felt nothing except a mild satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The guards found his body during the next cell inspection. They recorded his death as natural causes, a brain aneurysm brought on by poor nutrition and stress. No one questioned this diagnosis because questioning would have required paperwork and investigations that served no useful purpose. Vero disappeared from the prisoner manifest as if he'd never existed, and someone else was assigned to his cell within hours. That night, Bjorn nodded at me with something that might have been approval. "You're learning," he said. "The first kill is always the hardest. After that, it's just another skill like smithing or alchemy or any other thing you need to know to survive." He was right. The second death came easier, and the third easier still. By the end of my first year in the Imperial Prison, I'd stopped counting. Violence became just another aspect of daily routine, no more remarkable than eating or sleeping or hauling ore. The capacity for horror that had once defined the limits of my imagination expanded to accommodate realities I could never have conceived in my previous life. But the physical violence was only the most visible aspect of how the prison consumed us. The real destruction happened slowly, invisibly, in the gradual erosion of everything that made us human. They fed us just enough to keep us functional, but never enough to feel satisfied. They gave us just enough sleep to prevent total collapse, but never enough to feel rested. They provided just enough healing magic to prevent epidemics, but never enough to eliminate suffering. The psychological warfare was more sophisticated. They'd occasionally announce that certain prisoners were being considered for early release or transfer to minimum security facilities, creating desperate competitions as inmates tried to prove their rehabilitation through increased productivity or voluntary cooperation with guards. These announcements were always lies. No one left the Imperial Prison except in body bags or as part of the necromancy research programs. The necromancy program was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. Prisoners who volunteered for it were told their sentences would be commuted in exchange for participating in magical research, that they'd help advance the Empire's understanding of restoration magic and life extension. The reality was far darker. They were taken to the Arcane University's secret laboratories beneath the prison, where battle mages and necromancers used them as test subjects for spells that pushed the boundaries between life and death. I watched friends disappear into those laboratories, convinced they were choosing survival over slow death by exhaustion. Caius, the tax collector who'd helped me understand the rules of survival, volunteered after receiving news that his family had been declared dead in a mudcrab attack near Breville. He couldn't bear the thought of continuing to exist in a world where his suffering served no purpose, and the promise of contributing to magical advancement seemed preferable to meaningless endurance. The last time I saw him, he was shambling through the corridor outside my cell, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His eyes had taken on the milky white color of the undead, and his skin had the waxy quality of a corpse preserved by necromantic magic. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Caius was gone, replaced by a thing that wore his face and carried his memories but lacked any trace of his soul. He'd become a prison zombie, one of the unliving workers who maintained the deepest levels where even prisoners were no longer sent. The seasons changed above us, though we knew them only through subtle variations in temperature and humidity that filtered down through the ventilation shafts. Summer brought stifling heat that made the already unbearable foundry work nearly lethal. Winter brought a chill that seeped through the rock and settled in our bones, making every movement painful and every breath visible in the frigid air. Years passed, or what felt like years. Time became elastic in the eternal twilight of the prison, stretching and compressing according to the rhythms of pain and relief that structured our existence. I lost track of my own age, forgetting whether I was 30 or 50 or somewhere in between. My hair went gray, then began to fall out in patches from the metal dust in the foundry. My teeth loosened, several falling out and leaving gaps that made eating more difficult and speaking more labored. The woman who cried in her sleep died during my third winter. I heard her final breath through the gap between our cells, a rattling exhalation that seemed to go on forever before finally stopping. The guards didn't remove her body for 2 days, and the smell of decay filled our entire block with a sweetish stench that clung to everything and everyone. When they finally came for her, they weren't gentle. I heard her remains being dragged down the corridor, a sound like wet cloth being pulled across rough stone. New prisoners arrived constantly. taking the places of those who died or been converted or simply disappeared into the administrative maze that swallowed inconvenient people. They came with the same wide-eyed terror I'd once felt, asking the same questions about justice and appeals and contact with family. The older inmates would look at them with expressions of distant pity, knowing these newcomers would either adapt or die, but that they would never again be the people they'd been before walking through those iron doors. I tried to help some of them, sharing what I'd learned about survival and the unwritten rules that governed our existence. Most listened politely and then ignored my advice, convinced their situation was temporary or that their innocence would somehow protect them from the grinding machinery of institutional cruelty. A few learned quickly enough to survive their first year, many didn't. The arena fights began during my 4th year, though the guards called them rehabilitative combats in their official reports. Prisoners who violated rules or failed to meet production quotas were selected to fight each other in a makeshift arena constructed in one of the larger storage caverns. The fights weren't to the death officially, but serious injuries were common and healing magic was applied only after the entertainment value had been extracted from our suffering. The guards and supervisors would watch from elevated platforms around the arena's perimeter, placing bets on outcomes and discussing our techniques with the detached professionalism of arena fans discussing professional gladiators. The comparison wasn't accidental. They were deliberately recreating the entertainment of the Imperial City Arena, but with prisoners instead of volunteers, and with stakes that went beyond gold and glory. I was selected for the arena after striking a guard who'd been taunting a dying Argonian in the cell next to mine. The guard had been describing in graphic detail how the prisoner's eggs had been confiscated and destroyed, taking pleasure in each hiss and sob his words produced. When I told him to stop, he turned his attention to me, speculating about what uses my body might serve once I was too weak for foundry work. The blow I struck was instinctive, driven by a rage that had been building for years but had never found an appropriate target. My fist caught him in the throat, not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to send him to his knees, gasping for air. He survived, but he never spoke normally again, and the permanent rasp in his voice became a constant reminder of what defiance could accomplish when properly applied. Of course, my punishment was inevitable. My opponent in the arena was a massive orc named Ugrash Gro Shadback, a former member of the Fighters Guild who'd been imprisoned for killing a nobleman's son in a drunken brawl. He was everything I wasn't: young, strong, experienced in combat, and completely without fear or hesitation. The crowd of guards and supervisors cheered as he entered the arena, their voices echoing off the stone walls like the howling of hungry wolves. The weapons provided were crude but effective: lengths of sharpened iron, weighted chains, pieces of broken pottery with edges sharp enough to slice through flesh. I chose a piece of iron bar with enough weight to break bone, but not so heavy it would slow me down. Ugrash selected a chain, testing its balance with the professional assessment of someone who'd spent years learning how to inflict pain efficiently. The fight lasted 19 minutes, though it felt like hours. Ugrash was stronger and faster, but I had advantages he didn't expect: desperation, cunning, and the accumulated rage of years spent watching good people destroyed by a system that fed on suffering. I avoided his direct attacks, using the arena's dimensions to stay mobile, looking for openings created by his confidence and aggression. When the opening came, I took it without hesitation. He overextended during a particularly vicious swing, and I stepped inside his guard, driving the iron bar into his knee with enough force to shatter the joint. He fell, roaring in pain and fury, and I hit him again, this time across the base of his skull. He folded forward into his own blood, twitching once before becoming still. The crowd cheered my victory, but their applause felt like condemnation. I'd become exactly what they wanted me to become: a killer who performed violence for their entertainment, a broken thing that had forgotten the difference between survival and surrender. The guards returned me to my cell with expressions of satisfaction, as if I'd passed some crucial test that proved their methods were working as intended. The victories that followed were easier technically, but more difficult emotionally. Each opponent was another prisoner like myself, someone who'd been shaped by the same forces and driven to the same desperate measures. I killed them efficiently without passion or hatred because efficiency was what the situation required and because caring too much about the people I killed would have made survival impossible. Between fights, I worked the foundry and tried to remember who I'd been before becoming a gladiator. The memories were fading, becoming abstract and uncertain, like stories someone had told me about people I'd never met. Had I really been a merchant once, traveling the gold road between Anvil and Kvatch with caravans full of goods? Had I really lived in a small house with a garden where I grew tomatoes and lavender for no reason, except that I found beauty in growing things? The details blurred together until I couldn't be certain what was memory and what was imagination. Perhaps I'd never been anything except what I was now, a prisoner, a killer, a thing that existed only to demonstrate what happened to those who opposed imperial authority. Perhaps my previous life was just a delusion, a comforting lie I'd created to make my current existence bearable. Bjorn died during my 5th year, killed not by violence but by a wasting disease that had been growing in his lungs for months. The foundry smoke had finally accumulated to toxic levels and his body simply stopped being able to process the poison. He faced death with the same steady pragmatism he'd brought to everything else, giving me advice about leadership and survival until his voice became too weak to carry across the cell. "Don't let them make you into something you can't live with," he told me during our last conversation, his words punctuated by wet coughing that sprayed blood onto the stone floor. I've seen good men become monsters in here, and monsters who found ways to stay human. The choice is always yours, even when it doesn't feel like there's a choice at all. His death left a vacuum in the prison's power structure that other inmates immediately moved to fill. The contests for leadership were violent and brief, resolved through assassination and betrayal rather than democratic process. I avoided involvement in these struggles, having learned that visibility was dangerous and that the safest position was often somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy, valuable enough to protect but not important enough to threaten. The new leader was a Redguard woman named Tanith, a former knight who'd been convicted of treason after refusing orders to raid a village suspected of harboring Stormcloak sympathizers. She was intelligent, ruthless, and completely committed to survival at any cost. Under her leadership, the prisoner organization became more efficient but also more brutal, with harsh punishments for any perceived disloyalty or weakness. She approached me after one of my arena victories, studying me with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to show mercy. "You fight well," she said. "But you fight like someone who still thinks he's going to leave this place. That's going to get you killed eventually." She was right, though I didn't want to admit it at the time. Some part of me was still holding on to the possibility of escape, release, or redemption, and that hope was making me careless. The most dangerous prisoners were those who'd accepted their fate completely, who'd stopped thinking about the future and focused entirely on the immediate requirements of survival. The escape attempt came during my 6th year, organized by a group of political prisoners who'd managed to bribe several guards and acquire detailed maps of the prison's layout. They invited me to join them, recognizing my combat skills and relatively good physical condition as assets that could improve their chances of success. When the plan was complex but achievable. Create a distraction during a shift change, overpower the guards at a secondary checkpoint, and use maintenance tunnels to reach the surface before alarms could be raised. I agreed to participate, though I knew the attempt was doomed. Not because the plan was flawed, but because escape was never really about leaving the prison. The real prison was what we'd become during our years of incarceration. The accumulated damage to our minds and souls that couldn't be left behind simply by walking through a different door. The attempt failed exactly as I'd expected, though not for the reasons I'd anticipated. The guards had known about the plan from the beginning, having been informed by one of the conspirators who'd been promised better treatment in exchange for cooperation. The informant was a Breton named Henri, a former clerk who'd been slowly dying from malnutrition and wanted to improve his chances of living long enough to see another summer. The guards allowed the escape attempt to proceed until we'd committed ourselves completely, then triggered alarm spells and sealed the tunnels we were using for our route. The hunt that followed wasn't urgent or desperate, but methodical. like hunters tracking down deer that had gotten into a grain store. They used paralysis spells to disable anyone who resisted, shock magic to force us out of hiding places, and casual violence to discourage future escape attempts. Of the 14 prisoners who participated in the attempt, 5 were killed immediately, 4 were selected for necromancy conversion, and the remaining 5 were returned to general population with enhanced restrictions and monitoring. I was among the survivors, though I wasn't certain whether that represented good fortune or bad. The enhanced restrictions meant solitary confinement for months, reduced food rations, and elimination from work assignments that might provide opportunities for further planning. Solitary confinement was a different kind of death, slower but more thorough than the quick violence of the arena or the gradual erosion of foundry work. The cell was smaller than my regular accommodations, barely large enough to lie down with my arms extended. No light except what filtered through a crack under the door, no human contact except the daily delivery of food, no sounds except my own breathing and heartbeat and the gradual dissolution of my sanity. I talked to myself constantly, carrying on conversations with people from my past who existed now only in increasingly unreliable memories. I told stories to the walls, recited poems I half-remembered from childhood, and sang songs whose words had been eroded by time and stress until only the melodies remained. The boundary between internal dialogue and external speech disappeared, and I found myself responding to voices that existed only in my head as if they were real people sitting beside me in the dark. The hallucinations began after the 3rd month, visual distortions that resolved into faces when I wasn't looking at them directly, movements in peripheral vision that suggested the presence of people who weren't there. Shadows that seemed to have depth and substance even in the absolute darkness. I knew these perceptions weren't real, but knowledge didn't make them less vivid or less disturbing. When they finally returned me to general population, I discovered the prison had changed in ways that went beyond normal attrition and replacement. New policies had been implemented, new punishments devised, new forms of degradation introduced for the entertainment of guards and supervisors. The arena fights had been expanded into a full tournament system with brackets and championships and betting pools that involved personnel from throughout the Legion command structure. The food had gotten worse, the work assignments more dangerous, the healing magic more perfunctory. Prisoners were dying at an accelerated rate, their bodies unable to cope with the increased demands and reduced support. The administration seemed to have concluded that the facility was becoming too expensive to maintain and had decided to resolve the problem by working the prisoners to death as quickly as possible. I'd been selected as a featured competitor in the championship tournament, my reputation as an arena fighter having grown during my absence. The other prisoners looked at me with expressions I couldn't interpret: fear, respect, envy, and something else that might have been pity. They knew, as I was beginning to understand, that being good at violence in this place wasn't an advantage but a curse that would eventually consume everything else I might have been. The tournament was structured as a series of elimination bouts, with winners advancing to face increasingly dangerous opponents until only one fighter remained. The prizes for victory were meaningless: extra food rations, improved cell assignments, promises of reduced sentences that everyone knew would never be honored. The real purpose was entertainment, a gladiatorial spectacle that allowed the guards to bet on outcomes while watching prisoners destroy each other for their amusement. My first opponent was a young Imperial named Marcus, barely 22 years old and convicted of desertion during a Legion patrol. He'd been in the prison for less than a year, and his body still showed signs of the life he'd lived before arrest. He moved like someone who'd never learned to fight properly, relying on desperation and adrenaline rather than technique and experience. I killed him quickly, efficiently, and without pleasure. The crowd cheered, but their voices sounded distant and unimportant, like background noise from another room. I'd crossed some invisible line during my months in solitary confinement, and the emotional responses that had once made violence difficult were no longer accessible to me. I felt nothing when he died except a mild satisfaction that the problem had been resolved. The subsequent matches followed the same pattern, opponent after opponent, each one desperate and frightened and ultimately insufficient to the task of survival. I dispatched them with increasing mechanical precision, my movements becoming more efficient as I eliminated anything that wasn't essential to winning. The crowds grew larger and more enthusiastic as word spread throughout the facility about the tournament's progress. The final match was against Tanith, the Red Guard knight who'd taken over Bjorn's position as leader of the prisoner organization. She was older, more experienced, and completely ruthless in her approach to both leadership and combat. More importantly, she had nothing left to lose, having long ago abandoned any hope of survival or redemption in favor of simple endurance. "One of us walks away," she told me as we prepared for the fight, her voice carrying no anger or fear, just flat statement of fact. "The other becomes fertilizer for whatever weeds grow in the prison graveyard. But either way, we're both already dead. We died the day we walked through those doors. Everything since then has just been our bodies learning to catch up." She was right, and that knowledge liberated me from the last constraints of conscience and humanity. I fought her with everything I'd learned during my years in the Imperial Prison, using every technique of violence and deception that had allowed me to survive when better people had died. The match lasted longer than any of the others, both of us too experienced to make the obvious mistakes that would have ended the fight quickly. When I finally killed her, it was through treachery rather than superior skill. I feigned an injury that caused her to lower her guard for just long enough to position myself for a killing blow. The strike caught her in the temple, crushing bone and driving fragments into her brain. She fell without a sound, her face showing no surprise or accusation. Only the distant expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. The crowd erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the stone walls like the screaming of the damned. I stood over Tanith's body, covered in her blood and my own, feeling absolutely nothing. The tournament was over, the championship was mine, and none of it mattered because we were all already dead and had been dead from the beginning. They returned me to my cell that night with promises of rewards and improved conditions that I knew were lies. The tournament had served its purpose, providing entertainment for the guards and demonstrating to other prisoners what happened to those who became too skilled at violence. I would continue to fight when called upon, continue to kill whoever they placed in front of me, until I became too old or too damaged to be useful and was quietly disposed of. The years that followed blurred together into an indistinguishable mass of routine violence and grinding despair. I fought in the arena when summoned, worked the foundry when assigned, and existed in my cell during the hours between obligations. The other prisoners avoided me now, recognizing that I'd become something different from what I'd been. Something more dangerous but also more broken. New inmates continued to arrive, taking the places of those who died or been converted or simply disappeared into the administrative machinery that processed human suffering with industrial efficiency. I watched them go through the same stages of adaptation or destruction that I'd experienced, but I felt no connection to their struggles and offered no assistance or advice. Their survival or death was irrelevant to me because survival itself had become irrelevant. The dreams, when they came, were not of freedom or revenge or justice, but of simple non-existence. I dreamed of dissolving into the walls of my cell, becoming part of the stone that contained us all. I dreamed of forgetting my own name, my own history, my own face in whatever mirror might still show reflections in this place. I dreamed of peace, the kind that comes only when consciousness finally stops and the burden of selfhood is lifted from shoulders that have carried it too long. But consciousness persisted, stubborn and unwelcome, dragging me through each day and into each night with mechanical regularity. My body continued to function despite the accumulated damage from years of poor nutrition, metal dust inhalation, and frequent violence. My mind continued to process sensory input and form memories, even though the experiences being recorded were too similar to previous experiences to be worth remembering. I measured time now not in days or months, but in deaths. The deaths of opponents in the arena. The deaths of cellmates from disease or violence or simple exhaustion. The deaths of parts of myself that had once seemed essential but had proven to be expendable when survival demanded it. Each death was a mark on an invisible calendar that tracked my journey from human being to something else, something that wore human shape but had forgotten human purpose. The administrators occasionally visited my cell, studying me with the clinical interest of scholars observing an alchemical reaction. They asked questions about my experiences, my observations about prison conditions, my recommendations for improving the efficiency of the correctional process. I answered honestly because honesty required less effort than deception, and because truth and lies had lost their distinction in a place where neither mattered. "You've adapted remarkably well," one of them told me during a routine evaluation in my 7th year. He was a senior administrator named Gaius Corvinus, gray-haired and soft-spoken with the patient demeanor of someone conducting long-term agricultural experiments. "Your survival duration has exceeded our initial projections by 417%. You've become quite valuable as a data point. A data point. Not a person, not even a prisoner anymore, but a statistical anomaly worthy of continued observation." I asked him what happens to valuable data points, and he smiled with what might have been genuine warmth if warmth could exist in a place where hope came to rot. "We learn from them," he said simply, "and then we apply those lessons to improve the system." The improvement came in the form of new intake protocols based on patterns extracted from survivors like myself. They'd identified characteristics that correlated with extended survival, certain personality traits, physical attributes, behavioral patterns that predicted adaptation rather than breakdown. New prisoners were now being screened more carefully, sorted into categories that determined not just their cell assignments but their projected utility and optimal disposal timelines. I was told this with the casual pride of an artisan describing refinements to his craft. The administrator showed me charts and graphs that tracked mortality rates before and after the new protocols were implemented. The efficiency gains were impressive. Fewer prisoners dying uselessly in the first months, more reaching the productive phase where their labor offset the costs of maintenance. The system was learning, evolving, becoming better at what it had always done, converting human beings into measurable outputs. They asked if I had recommendations for further improvements. I suggested reducing the psychological torture components of solitary confinement. Not from compassion, but because the data showed that prisoners subjected to extended isolation often suffered permanent cognitive damage that reduced their long-term productivity. The administrator nodded approvingly and made notes in his ledger, pleased that I understood the optimization framework that governed our existence. That night, lying on my stone shelf in the darkness, I tried to remember what moral outrage felt like. I searched through the ruins of my conscience for some fragment of the person who would have been horrified by my collaboration, who would have chosen death over complicity. But that person was gone, dissolved into the same shadows that consumed everyone who stayed in this place long enough. What remained was something more practical, more adaptable, more capable of surviving but less capable of caring that survival had become indistinguishable from surrender. The transfer to the research wing came during my 8th year, presented as a promotion earned through exceptional adaptation. They moved me to a larger cell with actual bedding, a thin mattress that felt luxurious after years of stone, and increased my food rations to portions that left me feeling almost satisfied. The work assignments stopped. Instead, I spent my days being examined by mages and scholars who measured every aspect of my physical and mental condition with instruments that glowed with detection spells. They were studying resilience. Specifically, they wanted to understand the mechanisms by which certain prisoners maintained functionality despite conditions designed to break them. My body had become a text to be read, my mind a laboratory for exploring the limits of human adaptability. They cast diagnostic spells that revealed the accumulated damage, lungs scarred by years of metal dust and bad air, bones thinned by poor nutrition, a nervous system rewired by constant vigilance into permanent hyperarousal. "Fascinating," murmured a Breton mage named Amélie Beaumont as she reviewed the spectral readings that mapped my deterioration. "Your body should have failed years ago, yet you continue to function at acceptable levels. There's something in your neurochemistry, a compensatory mechanism we haven't seen in other subjects. She explained that my brain had essentially rewired itself to operate efficiently under conditions of extreme stress and deprivation. The same psychological processes that had allowed me to dissociate during foundry work and kill without emotional response had created neural pathways that made me extraordinarily resistant to the normal limits of human endurance. I was, in her clinical terminology, an optimized prisoner. Someone who'd been broken and rebuilt by the system into something more useful than what I'd been before. The other research subjects were prisoners like myself, survivors who'd outlasted their projected disposal dates and become valuable enough to preserve for study. There was Thomas, a Nord who'd been imprisoned for 12 years and had developed the ability to sleep standing up during work shifts, his body entering a semi-conscious state that provided rest without interrupting productivity. There was Lyra, an Imperial woman whose emotional responses had been so thoroughly suppressed that she could witness or commit acts of extreme violence without any measurable stress response. We were specimens in a collection, examples of what human beings could become when subjected to sufficient pressure. The researchers treated us with the detached professional courtesy extended to valuable laboratory equipment. We were expensive to maintain and difficult to replace, therefore worthy of care but never worthy of consideration as people with rights or dignity or any claim to treatment beyond what optimization demanded. The experiments began small. They tested our pain thresholds by applying gradually increasing intensities of shock spells while monitoring our physiological responses. They examined our decision-making under stress by presenting us with impossible choices and measuring how quickly we abandoned ethical frameworks in favor of survival calculations. They induced controlled psychological breaks by manipulating our environment and observing how we reassembled our fractured identities afterward. I participated willingly because participation brought privileges. Better food, actual blankets, books to read during the long hours between examinations. The books were mostly technical manuals and historical texts approved by the administration, nothing that might encourage resistance or hope. But they were words on pages, and words were windows into worlds that weren't this one. I read about the founding of the Empire, about the Oblivion Crisis and the heroes who'd saved Tamriel, about distant provinces where people lived lives that didn't involve counting guard patrols or measuring survival in days. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was reading about freedom while being systematically documented as an example of perfect imprisonment. I was learning about heroes who'd resisted tyranny while demonstrating how completely tyranny could reshape resistance into collaboration. The books told me who I might have been in another life, while the experiments confirmed what I'd become in this one. Amelie Beaumont sometimes talked to me between examinations, asking questions that went beyond the immediate research protocols. She wanted to know about my internal experience, not just the measurable physiological responses, but the subjective sensations of transformation. Did I remember the moment I stopped feeling guilt? Could I identify when survival had replaced morality as my primary framework for decision-making? Was there a specific incident that marked the transition from person to function? I told her the truth, which was that there had been no single moment, but rather a gradual erosion so subtle I'd never noticed myself changing until the change was complete. It was like watching a river wear down stone, invisible in any individual moment, but undeniable when you compared the beginning to the end. She nodded and recorded my responses in her ledger, pleased that my testimony supported her theories about institutional transformation. "You're helping us understand something important," she told me after one particularly long session. "The Empire needs to know how to process large populations efficiently. War produces prisoners by the thousands, rebels and cultists, and anyone who challenges authority. If we can identify the mechanisms that make some prisoners adaptable and others resistant, we can optimize the entire correctional system. Your suffering has meaning. Prisoner 4117, it serves the Empire." She meant it as comfort, I think, or as justification, the idea that my destruction had purpose, that the systematic dismantling of my humanity contributed to some larger good. But purpose and meaning had divorced themselves from each other during my years in this place. My suffering had purpose, efficiency, data, optimization, but meaning required context that extended beyond utility, and that kind of meaning had died long ago, buried under the weight of too many compromises and too many surrenders. The administrator's announcement came during my 9th year, delivered to all research subjects simultaneously through a prison-wide communication spell that made his voice echo directly inside our skulls. The research program had achieved its objectives. The data had been collected, analyzed, and compiled into new protocols that would transform Imperial correctional philosophy for generations to come. We, the survivors who'd provided this valuable information, would be rewarded for our service. The reward was transfer to a minimum security agricultural facility on the surface, real sunlight, fresh air, work that didn't involve molten metal or gladiatorial combat, the possibility, however remote, of eventual release or at least a death that came from natural causes rather than administrative disposal. It sounded like salvation, like the hope that Bjorn had told me to abandon had somehow been justified all along. They processed us out of the research wing with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had processed us in. Medical examinations to ensure we were healthy enough for transfer. Psychological evaluations to confirm we'd been sufficiently broken to pose no escape risk. New uniforms, these ones brown instead of red, marking us as reformed prisoners rather than dangerous ones. The change felt significant until I remembered that uniform colors were administrative categories, not meaningful indicators of status or treatment. The journey to the surface took 6 hours in transport wagons that lurched and creaked along roads I couldn't see. They kept us shackled and blindfolded, preventing any opportunity to learn the route or gather information that might facilitate escape. Not that escape was possible. Where would we go? How would we survive in a world we no longer understood, with bodies that had been reshaped by years of imprisonment and minds that had forgotten how to navigate anything except captivity? When they finally removed the blindfolds, the sunlight was physically painful. My eyes had adapted to the permanent twilight of the underground prison, and the sudden brightness felt like needles being driven directly into my brain. I squeezed my eyes shut reflexively, then forced them open again, determined to see the sky even if seeing it hurt. The blue was so vast, so impossible. After years of stone ceilings and guttering torches, I tried to remember if it had always been this color or if my memory had distorted it into something less overwhelming. The agricultural facility was a sprawling complex of fields and barracks built on cleared forest land somewhere in the Gold Coast region. I recognized the climate even if I couldn't identify the specific location. Crops stretched to the horizon in geometric patterns, maintained by hundreds of prisoners whose brown uniforms marked them as reformed and therefore trusted with agricultural production that fed Imperial citizens throughout the province. Our work assignment was simple. Plant, maintain, harvest, repeat, 12 hours per day during growing season, slightly less during winter. The labor was physically demanding but not deliberately cruel, designed to maximize productivity rather than inflict suffering. We worked under the supervision of guards who carried shock staves but rarely used them. Having learned that reformed prisoners generally complied without the need for active coercion, the food improved, not substantially, but enough to notice. Vegetables from the fields we tended supplemented with grain porridge and occasional meat that might have been actual livestock rather than rats or mystery protein. The barracks had individual bunks with mattresses and blankets that retained heat. There were washing facilities where we could clean ourselves weekly, removing some of the accumulated grime that had become a second skin during our years underground. It should have felt like mercy. It should have felt like the hope I'd abandoned had been vindicated, like survival had led somewhere better than continued suffering. But the improvements only highlighted how completely I'd been transformed by the prison. I couldn't enjoy the sunlight without calculating guard positions and escape routes out of habit. I couldn't appreciate the better food without analyzing it for the chemical compounds that might be present. I couldn't feel gratitude for the reduced violence without recognizing that reduced violence was still violence, just more efficiently administered. The other prisoners seemed similarly damaged. We worked in silence mostly, each of us locked inside internal worlds that had been shaped by our individual descents. Occasionally, someone would try to start a conversation, reaching for connection or community or some echo of the social behaviors that had once come naturally. These attempts usually failed within minutes, trailing off into uncomfortable silence as we remembered that we didn't know how to talk to each other anymore, didn't know how to care about anything beyond immediate survival and compliance. Thomas the Nord, who'd learned to sleep standing up, collapsed during harvest one afternoon. His body had finally reached the limits of what compensatory mechanisms could sustain. The guards carried him to the medical barracks, and we never saw him again. No funeral, no announcement, just an empty bunk that was occupied by someone else the next day. His disappearance was recorded in administrative logs as routine attrition, a predictable outcome of long-term imprisonment that required no investigation or explanation. I realized then that the agricultural facility wasn't mercy or reward, it was the final stage of processing, the place where prisoners were extracted for remaining utility before disposal. We were being used up at a slower rate than in the underground prison, but we were still being used up, still being converted into measurable outputs until we reached the point where continued maintenance exceeded our productive value. The realization brought something that might have been despair if I'd still been capable of strong emotions. Instead, it brought only tired acknowledgement, another data point added to the internal catalog of institutional realities. This was what the Empire had learned from studying specimens like us, that prisoners could be preserved longer and worked more efficiently if you gave them just enough improvement to make continued endurance possible. The suffering didn't need to be maximal. It just needed to be sustainable. The seasons cycled through their endless rotation: spring planting, summer maintenance, autumn harvest, winter dormancy. My body continued its slow deterioration, accumulating damage that no amount of improved nutrition could reverse. The lung scarring from the foundries made breathing difficult during heavy labor. The bone density loss made every fall potentially catastrophic. The nervous system hypervigilance meant I never truly slept, just entered a state of reduced awareness that left me feeling perpetually exhausted. During my 10th year on the surface, my 19th year of imprisonment total, they conducted another round of medical evaluations. The examining mage was young, probably fresh from the arcane university, with the earnest efficiency of someone who hadn't yet learned to see prisoners as human. He cast his diagnostic spells, reviewed the spectral readings, and made notes in his ledger with increasing focus. "Your cognitive function has declined 17% since your last evaluation," he announced, as if this were interesting data rather than evidence of my approaching obsolescence. "Motor control is degrading, reaction times are significantly impaired, and your cardiovascular system shows signs of imminent failure. I'd estimate you have 6 months of productive capacity remaining, perhaps 8 if we implement enhanced medical intervention. 6 to 8 months. The same calculation they'd made when I first arrived at the Imperial Prison, except this time it was probably accurate. My body had been pushed beyond sustainable limits for nearly 2 decades, and the accumulated damage was finally approaching the threshold where continued function became impossible. I was becoming waste, transitioning from the category of useful inventory to disposable surplus. The mage asked if I wanted to know what would happen when my productive capacity ended. I told him yes, not because I cared particularly, but because knowledge was the only form of control available to someone who'd lost the capacity for agency. He explained with the detached professionalism of someone describing inventory management procedures. When prisoners reached terminal inefficiency, they were transferred to recycling facilities where their bodies were processed into fertilizer for the agricultural fields. The procedure was painless. A swift magical execution followed by alchemical breakdown that converted organic matter into nutrient-rich compounds. Nothing was wasted. Hair, bones, organs, everything was reduced to base elements and repurposed for continued production. Even in death, we served the Empire's efficiency. "You should feel proud," the mage told me as he concluded the examination. "Your entire existence from intake through disposal represents optimal resource utilization. You've contributed far more to Imperial prosperity than most citizens ever will." The crops that grow from your recycled remains will feed soldiers and workers for years to come. He meant it as genuine praise, I think. In the Empire's mathematical framework, I had been a success story, a prisoner who'd survived long enough to provide valuable research data, then continued functioning in productive labor for nearly a decade afterward. My death would complete a perfect loop of utility, transforming even my corpse into measurable output. It was, by the metrics that mattered to the system, the closest thing to a good death that someone like me could hope to achieve. I returned to my bunk that night and tried to calculate what I felt about the approaching end. The person I'd been before imprisonment would have felt terror or rage or desperate hope for last-minute reprieve. But that person had been gone for so long that remembering his emotional responses felt like reading about a stranger in a history book. What I felt was closer to relief. Not the relief of escape or freedom, but the relief of completion, of a story reaching its natural conclusion without the need for further endurance. The woman who cried in her sleep during my early months in the underground prison, I remembered her now. Though I couldn't recall her name or crime or face, she'd once told me, in a moment of terrible clarity between nightmares, that the worst part of imprisonment wasn't the suffering but the endlessness of it. The sense that no matter how much you survived, there would always be more surviving required, stretching forward into an infinite future without variation or possibility. She'd been wrong about the infinite part. Everything ended eventually, even suffering, even the capacity for suffering. My end was scheduled now, calculated and logged in administrative ledgers, waiting for me at the intersection of declining productivity and economic efficiency. It was coming whether I resisted or accepted, whether I raged against it or welcomed it, and that certainty was the final gift the prison had given me. The knowledge that some choices really weren't choices at all, that surrender and acceptance were sometimes the same thing. The final months passed with the slow inevitability of winter transitioning to spring. My body continued its systematic failure, each day bringing new limitations and diminished capacities. Tasks that had once been routine became challenging, then impossible. I could no longer maintain the pace required during harvest, falling behind quotas despite maximum effort. The guards noted these failures in their logs, tracking my decline with the same careful attention they'd once paid to my adaptation. Other prisoners began avoiding me, recognizing the signs of approaching disposal and not wanting to be reminded of their own eventual fates. I didn't blame them. I'd done the same thing in the underground prison, steering clear of those who'd begun their terminal spirals, treating their deaths as administrative events rather than human tragedies because empathy required emotional capacity I'd needed to preserve for my own survival. Amelie Beaumont visited the agricultural facility during my final weeks. Apparently conducting follow-up research on her former specimens, she found me in the fields during a rest period, sitting in dirt that might have contained the recycled remains of Thomas or the woman who'd cried in her sleep or any of thousands of prisoners who'd been processed through this same terminal pathway. "How do you feel?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that might have been genuine curiosity rather than clinical detachment. I told her the truth, which was that I felt tired, not the physical exhaustion that came from hard labor, but a deeper weariness that existed at the level where identity and will resided. I was tired of counting things, guard patrols and days and failures, and the shrinking number of moments remaining before my story reached its conclusion. I was tired of surviving, of the constant calculations required to maintain existence that no longer held meaning or purpose beyond its own continuation. "Do you have regrets?" she asked, pulling out her ledger to record my responses even now. Even at the end, I considered the question carefully, searching through memories that had become increasingly unreliable for moments that might constitute regret. Did I regret the crime that had brought me here? I couldn't remember it clearly enough to form judgments. Did I regret the choices I'd made during imprisonment, the killings, the collaborations, the gradual surrenders that had transformed me from person to function? Those hadn't really been choices in any meaningful sense, just responses to situations where every option was a form of compromise and survival required accepting whichever compromise the moment demanded. I regret that I can't remember the color of grass properly, I told her finally. I mean, I can see it here. I can look down right now and observe that it's green. But I can't remember what it felt like to see grass before prison, when green was just a color instead of data my eyes are processing. I regret that everything beautiful has become information, that I lost the capacity to experience anything except survival. She nodded and wrote in her ledger, and I wondered if my response would contribute to future refinements of the Imperial correctional system. Perhaps they'd learn that prisoners retained aesthetic memory longer than emotional memory, that sensory experiences degraded at different rates than social bonds. Perhaps someone somewhere would read my testimony and use it to optimize the breaking of people not yet born, improving the efficiency with which human beings were converted into productive outputs. The transfer order came on a morning that felt like any other morning, which seemed appropriate for an ending that wasn't really an ending but just a final administrative step. The guards collected me from my bunk with the same professional courtesy they'd shown throughout my time at the agricultural facility. They shackled my wrists gently because at this point I posed no threat and everyone knew it, and led me to a transport wagon that would carry me to the recycling facility. The other prisoners watched silently as I was loaded into the wagon. No farewells, no expressions of solidarity or grief they'd learned, as I had learned years ago that emotional investment in others' fates was a liability that survival couldn't afford. I was simply the next iteration of a pattern they'd witnessed countless times before and would witness countless times again, until their own turns came and they made the same silent exit into systematic termination. The recycling facility was a low stone building surrounded by carefully tended gardens that bloomed with flowers of every conceivable color. The gardens were fertilized by processed prisoner remains, which made the beauty feel like mockery until I remembered that beauty and mockery weren't mutually exclusive categories. The flowers didn't care about the source of their nutrients, and their indifference was actually more honest than any emotional response could have been. They processed me through intake, another set of forms, another round of measurements and classifications. The clerk was an elderly imperial woman with kind eyes who offered me water and asked if I needed anything to make the transition more comfortable. I told her no, and thanked her for asking and wondered if she understood that she was part of a murder machine that had killed thousands, or if her kindness insulated her from that recognition. The execution chamber was clean and simply furnished, a stone platform in the center, restraint points for securing subjects, magical circles inscribed in the floor for the termination spell. An imperial battle mage stood ready, his hands already glowing with the pale blue light of gathered magic. He looked bored, the way someone might look while performing routine maintenance tasks, and I appreciated his honesty more than I would have appreciated false solemnity. They secured me to the platform with leather straps that smelled faintly of disinfectant and previous occupants. The battle mage approached and asked if I had any final words. The question was pro forma, required by some regulation designed to create the appearance of dignity around disposal, and I almost declined to answer. But some fragment of the person I'd been before, or perhaps just the institutional conditioning that made compliance automatic, prompted me to speak. I have been dead for 19 years, 2 months, and 14 days, I said, echoing the opening declaration that had framed my entire testimony. The Empire has simply taken this long to make the death official. Everything between the iron door closing and this moment was just documentation, data collection on how long human tissue can continue to function after the person inhabiting it has been terminated. Thank you for completing the paperwork. The battle mage nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with my assessment, and began the casting sequence that would stop my heart and dissolve my flesh into components suitable for agricultural enrichment. The spell built slowly, power accumulating in structured patterns that I could feel even though I'd never studied magic formally. It felt warm, almost comfortable, like falling asleep after years of forced wakefulness. My last thought, as the magic reached its crescendo and began the process of systematic cellular dissolution, was that I'd forgotten to ask what they'd done with my original crime report. The document that had first classified me as Prisoner 417, classification, political, subclassification, sedition, minor, had set all of this in motion. But I'd never learned what specific act of sedition I'd supposedly committed. Perhaps I'd spoken against the Empire at a tavern, or written something critical in a letter that was intercepted, or simply been in the wrong place when an administrative example needed to be made. It didn't matter anymore. The person who'd committed that crime was as dead as the person I'd become, both of them dissolved into the same administrative records that would eventually be archived and forgotten. What remained was just data, measurements of survival duration, observations about adaptation mechanisms, calculations of optimal resource utilization. I had been converted finally and completely into information that would help the Empire process the next generation of prisoners more efficiently. The magic reached its peak. Everything dissolved into warmth and light, and the sensation of boundaries becoming permeable, of self-diffusing into something larger and less defined than individual consciousness. It wasn't painful. It wasn't terrifying. It wasn't anything except conclusion, the period at the end of a sentence that had run on far too long. The final mathematical operation that resolved all previous calculations into zero. This is what prison is like in the Empire. This is what happens when efficiency becomes the highest virtue and human beings become inventory to be optimized. This is the machine I was fed into, and these are the forms I took as the machine ground me down into components suitable for repurposing. I was prisoner 42117. I was a person once, though I can barely remember who. I was broken and rebuilt and broken again until breaking and rebuilding became indistinguishable from normal function. I was studied and documented and used and disposed of with the same careful attention to resource optimization that the Empire brings to every aspect of its vast administrative apparatus. And now I am fertilizer, feeding flowers that will bloom in gardens maintained by the next generation of prisoners, who will eventually become fertilizer themselves, continuing the cycle until the Empire finds even more efficient methods of converting human suffering into measurable outputs. This is prison. This is justice. This is what we become when we accept that people are problems to be solved rather than lives to be valued. Remember this, if you can. Remember that behind every statistic about crime and punishment, behind every justification for increasingly harsh correctional policies, behind every assurance that the system is working as intended, remember that there are people being systematically destroyed, not through malice but through optimization, not through cruelty but through efficiency. Remember prisoner 42117, who was dead for 19 years before the paperwork finally caught up to the reality. Remember that the person telling you this story died long before the story ended, and everything afterward was just documentation of how long a corpse can be made to function when the system demands maximum utility extraction. Remember, because forgetting is how this happens. Forgetting is how people become inventory. Forgetting is how the machine continues grinding, generation after generation, converting human beings into data points in efficiency reports. I forgot who I was. I forgot why that mattered. I forgot everything except survival. And even survival eventually forgot me. Don't forget,